Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. My name is Matt Gagel. I am the Director of Programs here at Montgomery History, and we're very glad you've joined us. Before we get started, I'm going to go over a few quick announcements as per usual, and then we'll jump right into the presentation. So I will try not to take too much of your time, and then we can hand things over to Mr. Phil Edwards. Okay, as always, as I mentioned, thank you so much for joining us. During the program, if you have any questions, please use the Q&A button. Those will come to me. We will be doing a Q&A session at the end of the talk. We'll try to get to as many questions as we can, and I do apologize in advance if I'm not able to get to every single one. We'll do our best. Okay, next thing we have here, next week we have a rewind, which are our weekly or basically a video pre-recorded talk that's available the entire week on our website. Next week we'll be highlighting Freedom Seekers on the Maryland's Underground Railroad, a book and talk by Jenny Mazur, who I am completely blanking on where she worked. I think she worked for the National Underground Railroad Museum, but I think that is wrong, so I do apologize. But she is connected with the Parks Department, was formerly, and wrote this book, which is fantastic. Okay, so that'll be available next Monday around 10 o'clock, as well as a recording of today's talk will be available. Those are available for 1 week, and you can share and watch them as many times as you'd like. I'd also like to give a special thank you to those who've made financial support, provided financial support to Montgomery History. We are not able to offer free programs except with your help. So we do appreciate all those who have done so. If you'd like to make a donation, you can visit our website, montgomeryhistory.org, and click on the Donate Now button, and it'll guide you through that process. Oh, yes, of course, last but certainly not least, March 9th is National History Day, and we need you. We need you and your passion for history. You do not have to be an expert. You don't need a degree in history, just have to like history. And I assume if you're watching this talk that you're interested in history in some way. And what do we need you for? We need you to help judge National History Day. National History Day is a contest that takes place every year. And this year it'll be at Loiterman Middle School on March 9th. And students from all over the county have been working very hard, very diligently to put together presentations, poster displays, video documentaries, research papers, and we need your help judging those and helping encourage students to develop a passion for history. We need a lot of judges. There's over 600 students this year, so more judges will help the process run smoothly. We are anticipating that we'll need judges there from 8 a.m. to 2 p.m. and we'll be providing breakfast, light refreshments for breakfast, as well as a lunch. And we will be providing a virtual training session. I believe it's February 27th and 29th. I'm not certain about that second date, but I believe it's the 29th from 6:30 to 7:30 p.m. And we will be recording that. So if you're not able to attend the virtual session, you can watch that. So that'll be the training. You don't have to go anywhere. You can just log in from home like you're doing now. And we would really appreciate that. I know the students do appreciate that as well. The winners of this contest will go on to the Maryland State competition. And Montgomery County always does a phenomenal job, sends a lot of presentations. So there's the QR code you can scan on there, and we will be sending out a reminder email later this week, and it's of course in our e-news. If you have any questions about that, you can certainly send me an email or put it in the chat and I can help you out. Okay, that's enough from me. You didn't come here to listen to me talk. So I'm going to stop my screen share and we'll get Phil going here. Let me stop this real quick. Give me one moment. It's Phil's microphone unmuted there. All right, are you there, Phil?
I am.
All right, let's get your camera going. There you are. Okay.
Proof.
Okay, you are free to go. Take it away whenever you're ready.
Thank you. Thank you, Matt. Washington Grove. Called by its first mayor a town within a forest, an oasis of tranquility, and a rustic jewel in the diadem of the great free state of Maryland. This is the story of how it came to be chartered in 1873 and how it evolved into what it is today. Hi, I'm Phil Edwards. I was once mayor of our topic, Washington Grove. Afterward, I wrote two histories, the first about the association, ending in 1937, and the second about the town, ending in 1977, with an afterword to cover some subsequent events. The books are available on Amazon in print and ebook form. If you search Washington Grove, they should turn up. So let's see. So I'm having trouble with the slide, but
it is. I can see it. So is it
Yeah.
not advancing?
Yeah, I can see it. It just won't advance, but that's all right. We'll take a look at why
Okay.
that is for a sec.
All right, just a moment here, folks. We'll get this going.
Okay. No, should be, let's say, start from the beginning.
All right. Is it so? It's when you click on it, it's just not advancing, or is it?
Yeah, it wasn't advancing. So let me just let's try it this way. And we'll just, there we go.
Perfect.
Okay. No more glitches, please. That's a glitch. I was born in Riverdale in PG County in 1943. A year later, my father was sent to supervise a foreign broadcast listening station in Portland, Oregon. On our return after VJ Day in August 45, Washington had grown so much it was difficult to find housing anywhere closer than Rockville. We lived for a few months in some hastily built apartments on North Washington Street in Rockville. They're now long gone. January of 46, we moved out of Rockville to a rental property in the down at the heels town of Washington Grove. It would be home for almost 50 years. What makes Washington Grove an outlier among the towns and small cities of Montgomery County? The answer is how it was founded in 1873, the way its government evolved, its street and avenue patterns, its unique architecture, and I might add, its spirit. How did all that happen? This is the Martinet and Bond map of Montgomery County. It's always disorienting to me because north on this map is somewhere in the upper left, toward the upper left. So it's a little disorienting. Montgomery County was founded in 1776 out of Frederick County, consisted of a river port on the right of the map, a vast collection of tobacco farms to the northwest, and a very important corridor between Georgetown and what would become the National Road passing through Frederick. In 1758, that was the corridor that General Braddock and George Washington used to get from Virginia to their disastrous meeting with the French and Indians at Fort Duquesne. The county lost its port and anchor when the District of Columbia was founded, but the remainder of the county grew steadily for the next 100 years. As it grew, its epicenter migrated slowly north along that corridor, up to Bethesda Meeting House, a settlement at the convergence of two north-south trails. Thence to Rockville, a gathering and shipping point for tobacco and other agricultural products. Originally known as Hungerford's Tavern, then after it was named the county seat, it was called Montgomery Courthouse, but by the time it became incorporated in 1860, it was universally called Rockville. Farther up the corridor was Logtown, also called Forest Oak, a sleepy village at a crossroads in the heart of Montgomery County. Not much to look at, but Benjamin Gaither ran a store there, and like so many settlements, it would finally be named for the store owner, Gaithersburg. Gaithersburg would not be incorporated till 1878. For much of the Civil War, the corridor was a conduit for soldiers and provisioners of both armies. Gaithersburg had become quite prosperous when successful farmer John DeSelum, a Northern sympathizer but a slaveholder, wrote his account of what it was like to house an unwelcome army on his farm. If you can find a copy of Boyd's History of Montgomery County, I encourage you to read Saffel's entire account. Railroads. The county's first railroad opened in 1835 and connected Georgetown with Baltimore. But to go west from Washington by train, one would have to travel east almost to Baltimore to connect with the main line and eventually cross the Potomac. After the war was settled, in 1866, construction finally began for the B&O's Metropolitan Branch, a new line northwest out of Washington. By coincidence, a consortium of Washington's Methodist churches was looking for a camp meeting site and had zeroed in on the path of the new railroad. Camp meetings, where did they come from? John Wesley, an Englishman, wasn't happy with the Catholic or Anglican churches, didn't quite trust the Lutherans, and thought the Presbyterians were okay, but not fundamental enough. He had an epiphany and then rode all over the English countryside, speaking and gathering converts. He was very successful. Soon he was able to export his Wesleyan theology to America, where preachers Coke and Asbury had similar success using the camp meeting concept to bring Americans into the fold. Methodism thrived, particularly in the mid-Atlantic states, but the Civil War had put a stop to camp meetings. Tent revivals and camp meetings had long been successful at recruiting new converts, but the form had its drawbacks. You couldn't control who showed up. Also, you'd invest in the infrastructure, and by the next year, there was nothing to show for it. After the war ended and things were getting to the new normal, the Methodist churches of Washington attempted a restart. If they could own the campground, they could control it and retain their infrastructure investment from year to year. Once they'd focused on the new railroad line, they formed a corporation, authorized 1,000 shares of stock, and set about finding some ground to buy. They called their corporation the Washington Grove Camp Meeting Association of the District of Columbia and Maryland. In my research, I would learn that the 1,000 shares of stock and how the bylaws treated it was to be the fatal flaw that doomed the association in the long run. But the long run was a good one. Thus, the town that would become Washington Grove was incorporated even before they knew where it would be. How does a stock company operate? There's an elected board of trustees who enact bylaws and delegate responsibilities to the officers. There's a president on whom most of the day-to-day activities rest, and there's a mandatory annual meeting to which all stockholders are invited, although they can send proxies to do the voting if they wish. Here's a close-up of the Martinet and Boyd bond map. Again, north is to the upper left. The church leaders had a corporate structure. Now they just needed to find a site. A committee of 2 preachers and 2 laymen went looking. The site they wanted would have to be remote yet accessible. The new train line would pass through Rockville and for a time end at Gaithersburg. The high forested ground of Nathan Cook Sr.'s old farm lay along that line, and it was for sale. In this close-up of the Martinet and Boyd map, Rockville is at the lower right corner. Gaithersburg's to the left. A dirt road leads northeast out of Gaithersburg and crosses Nathan Cook's farm. After visiting the site, the Methodists entered into a contract with the widow Cook, contingent on a successful pledging of stock. The blue star indicates the site. Incidentally, Saffel's farm was just to the northwest of Cook's. The Camp Meeting Association of the District of Columbia, Maryland, was essentially to be a gated community. The gates would be open to everybody during camp meeting, but reserved for the stockholders and their families for the rest of the year. Only qualified buyers would be able to own stock, thus control of the grounds was assured. It's a way to do the work of the Lord and yet have a nice getaway during the summer. Like so many organizations of its time, the only way to become a member, in this case to purchase stock, was to be recommended by someone already in the group. In effect, it meant you had to be white, a Christian, preferably a Methodist. There were plenty of takers. We don't know exactly when or exactly where this picture was taken, but it certainly represents the setting up of the camp. They probably gathered in late spring at the Cook farm, then dispatched men and materials to lay a walkway from the depot to clear brush for tent sites, dig wells, and start building summer. In August of 1873, they held the first camp. The tent sites were arranged in perpendicular rows around an open square with rough benches and a raised platform for the speakers. Near the entrance to the camp, you could sign up for a tent and rent a wooden base and sign up for meals. In spite of heavy rains, the first camp was an enormous success. While stock ownership was exclusive, attendance at the camp meetings was not. Most campers came from the Washington area, but people also came from Gaithersburg, Emery Grove, Laytonsville, and as far away as Darnestown. The first convert had been a Presbyterian. For the second and subsequent camps, the tent sites had instead been set out in rows between 7 new avenues that radiated out from the square. And the square had become a circle on which a handsome tabernacle would be raised to shelter the speakers and guests. The spoken radial design was said to be inspired by L'Enfant's plan for Washington. The circle looks roughly the same today as it did in 1886, though without its tabernacle and with far fewer cottages. In these first camps, tent lots had been allocated mostly on a first-come, first-served basis, and there were only a few arguments about who got what site. Later, families would lay claim to the same site each year. The first stage of the association's life is what I like to call camp meeting euphoria. In spite of hard economic times, there'd been a panic on Wall Street that fall, and the country was in a depression for much of the 70s. But attendance and cottage building were robust during that time. Already by the third year, tenters were putting up sides on their platforms with high-peaked sheets of canvas against the rain. Later, these would become the narrow buildings with high-pitched roofs, 14 feet wide and 20, 30, or even 40 feet deep, that still underpin many of the houses in town today. While the tent department lots were tiny, nominally 15 by 40, the walk from the depot to the circle, illustrated in this slide, was laid out in cottage lots of 50 by 150 feet. You can see the circle at the top, and then these are the lots from the depot up Grove Avenue from the depot to the circle. These lots were separated by a grand promenade, 50 feet wide. The alleys and roads were to be only 10 to 25 feet. The bylaws established that 1 share of stock got you a tent site and 5 shares got you a large lot. By 1886, all the big lots were spoken for and several large cottages were already under construction. The 1880s was a time of settling in and building. Here's a picture of the tabernacle on the circle. I don't know what year, and you can see already there are cottages around that are at least partly wooden. There was a hotel on Grove Avenue Extended, then called Broadway. This is the Albany Hotel. If you didn't much like camping, you could get a room there. If you liked camping but didn't like preparing meals, you could take a meal there. This is the circle. Again, you can see the tabernacle on the left, and this is a little bit later where cottages are pretty much the way they look today. There's I think, a teenager walking some children there in the foreground. Neighbors. The Grove's closest neighbors were Gaithersburg and Emery Grove. Emery Grove was a robust Black enclave with a camp meeting tradition older than Washington Grove's. The coming of the railroad, with a stop at the Grove, gave much greater mobility to Emery Grove's residents. I don't know if these people had got off the train and were walking up Grove Avenue headed toward Emery Grove to their own camp meeting, or whether they were going to attend the Washington Grove camp meeting. This advertisement for a so-called Rockville camp meeting is actually for an Emery Grove camp. Why the ad is coy about where it was to be held and who was expected to participate isn't clear. Possibly the newspaper would not have run it for an integrated camp meeting. We don't know. There's much more to be said about Emery Grove. Its founding before the Civil War, its time of relative prosperity, and its near destruction 100 years later. But Emery Grove's a rich topic of its own, deserving of further study. The other close neighbor was Gaithersburg, a thriving agricultural center even before the railroad. Gaithersburg was for a time the terminus of the new line. At first, only one pair of tracks had been laid, so they had to build what was called a Y, where the engines could turn around and head back to Washington. This established Gaithersburg as a hub. In the Grove, the first major subdivision survey by J.E. Lang in 1886 showed all of the east side of Grove Avenue to the right, divided into 50 by 150-foot lots with wide avenues and several blocks reserved for parks. It was a deeply flawed plan, but it was something to show prospective stock purchasers. Speaking of stock, by this time there was more than a glimmer of difficulty with stock ownership versus lot ownership. By the late 1880s, the mechanics of stock being located on lots was already in disarray. There was stock that was not located, lots for which there was no stock, and a variety of renewable leases without clear rules for selling or trading them. In 1886, the original charter was amended. One change was to try to shift the tax burden assessments away from the stock and onto the lots and improvements. The other change was an attempt to standardize the leases for the owners of improved lots, but the very concept of leasing versus owning was relatively new in real estate, and leasing was facing a long future in the court system. This picture, though somewhat later, gives you an idea of the hubbub at the depot surrounding camp meeting time. At some of these early camps, as many as 10,000 people would show up on a good weekend. That building in the foreground is the original depot, an open-fronted building that would later be replaced by a proper station with waiting rooms heated by pot-belly stoves. A new, more practical survey was completed in 1897 by C.J. Maddox, the county surveyor. The new survey recognized the Chestnut Avenue area to the left of the depot as suitable for development. As with the Lang plat, it showed the entire East Woods developed into lots, but that area is low and poorly drained. It would never be practical to develop all of it. So the upper right corner of that is now a forest preserve. I believe it's still called the East Woods, and only the lower right has been developed. Chautauqua. Camp meetings flourished, but in the 1890s, Chautauqua became the driving force. Chautauquas were inspired by the Chautauqua Institution on Lake Chautauqua in New York, a summer camp for Sunday school teachers where they could learn more about the Bible and how to teach it. But the institution also had cultural and music programs. Soon, independent Chautauqua companies would package lectures, demonstrations, even pure entertainment into traveling shows and get those shows booked from place to place. Washington Grove was a desirable venue and an eager participant. Before long, the camp meeting, hitherto being 10 days to 2 weeks of being preached at, now had been enveloped by Chautauqua events. And both the camp meeting and Chautauqua had outgrown the circle. So here's a flyer for Chautauqua showing the new assembly hall. So the first building outside of the circle was public building, was an octagonal assembly hall that served for indoor worship and meetings. Now called McCatherine Hall, the building stands today, though with some very fine enhancements. Here's a view of the assembly hall. I don't know what year, and the Albany Hotel is there on the right in the background. This, by the way, was the view from my window for many years when I was young. This is another flyer for Chautauqua showing the new auditorium built a few years later. to replace the tabernacle as a place of gathering. It's a beautiful building. There's a shot of the building with people gathered out front for some event. This is a shot of the interior of the auditorium. A couple of those benches still survive today. That's the ladies' dressing room on the left. There was an identical one on the right. That chandelier is a gas-fired chandelier. At around this time, we finally got a proper railroad station. So the building on the left is the original depot, the open face depot, and then the station is there on across the tracks. Later, the original depot would be replaced by a covered waiting room, much smaller, that stood for many years. There's another shot of the new train station. Notice the milk cans in on the left there. That implies that some of the local farmers would take their milk to Washington Grove rather than Gaithersburg to have it shipped on to the city. By this time, there'd been one calamitous fire in the Grove. So now that the auditorium replaced the tabernacle and the assembly hall was there for indoor meetings, a new sport was introduced, that of thinning out the circle by moving cottages from there to the new, bigger lots. Over the winters, many cottages were moved and the lots abandoned. Many new houses on the big lots were started from circle area cottages. My own first house on the circle was made up of 2 cottages connected end to end. Many buildings were moved to Grove Avenue, Chestnut Avenue, and Maple Avenue. This is the men's club in the park, the same park that the auditorium is in, to the south end of it. And that is obviously a former cottage that was moved there for the purpose. The association was booming, but during this time, stocks and lots began to be traded without proper records being kept. And soon there were leaseholders without stock, stockholders without lots, and lot leases. There were also outstanding shares for which the proper owner was no longer known. This flaw would become an open sore during what I call the Walker era. Major Walker. In 1910, the Grove had been a rising star for more than 30 years. Major Sam Walker, Washington businessman, banker, devout Methodist, had been a stockholder since the 1890s. And by 1903, he and other family members owned houses in the cottage department. In that year, the Major was elected to the Board of Trustees for the first time. This is a picture of Major Walker's cottage service, was called, during a Washington Grove winter. Major Walker had a vision for the Grove. He wanted to see the Maddox plan fleshed out and the Grove fully occupied. He continued to purchase shares of stock as they became available. He intended to settle his family in the Grove and live it fully, if not year-round. As a bonus, though, the value of those shares would rise, but only if much-needed infrastructure was put in place. By 1909, the Major owned or controlled 20% of the stock. The trustees elected him president of the board. He was joined on the board by his son, Robert. His daughter, Lucretia Hardy, would later become a member as well. After taking office, Walker immediately went to work on major projects, no pun intended. Brown Street on the east side had long been a muddy path. He set out to build it up and solve the drainage problem. The Grove had no ready source of ice for food storage. The major established Maple Lake as an ice pond and recreation area. The town's sewers, both for sanitation and stormwater, were a disaster. He undertook a large project to install culverts and piping to shuttle the wastewater into the West Woods, below the springs, we hope. He self-financed some of these projects on only the hope of getting repaid. And the major continued to purchase stock. By 1912, his share was up to 27%. Oh, by the way, this is the girls' club that the major financed. It was on the opposite end of the park from the men's club. The major well understood about the flaw in the association's underpinnings. He knew that if you count the lots in the Maddox survey and multiply by 5, you're going to need a lot more than the 1,000 shares authorized by the charter. Something would have to give. In 1913, Walker put forward a stock buyback proposal. The association would call in all the existing stock and then reissue it according to a complicated formula that he devised. After that, only one share would be required to locate on a lot. But by this time, murmurings had blossomed into widespread discomfort, even alarm, that Major Walker would soon be in complete control of the corporation. The board took a hard look at the major's proposal for stock buyback and deemed it to be of benefit primarily to the major and his family. They voted no. Rebuffed, Walker resigned. But the stock story wasn't over. There's Major Walker a little later. There's Major Walker in the fields on the north end of Washington Grove, where he leased the land for farming. By this time, the essence of the Grove wasn't just the camp meeting, nor was it the Chautauqua events. It was a place to live and thrive, part of the year, and for some, all of the year. Sam Walker wasn't going away. He was still farming the land on the north end, and he was still accumulating stock. In 1914, the trustees took an extraordinary action. They started refusing to transfer shares to the major or his family. If they weren't transferred on the books, he couldn't vote them. In response, Walker's son Robert filed lawsuits on his and his mother's behalf. The suits dragged on, at first with a ruling in the Walkers' favor, but on appeal, the association prevailed. An uneasy peace reigned for the next few years. This is a shot of the men's club occupied by returning World War I soldiers, recuperating soldiers. By the end of the Great War, the Grove was home to a majority of year-round residents, but the lease deed ownership problems continued to simmer. Even with the waning of Chautauqua, progress continued. By the teens, the Grove had electricity. By the 20s, proper sewer and water, and a fire and rescue company shared with Gaithersburg. The auditorium, the ball fields, and tennis courts were in use for countywide competitions. There was a lot of baseball played in Washington Grove during those years. The Washington Grove Band, I think, founded by Roy McCatherine, who would later be mayor, shown here. I'm pretty sure that's Roy McCatherine on the far left holding, is it a cornet or is it a trumpet? I'm not sure. There's a shot of Roy McCatherine as a young patent attorney. In 1922, Roy McCatherine was elected president of the board, the first year-round resident to hold the job. In the early 20s, the corporation's charter was modified to drop the words camp meeting from its title. The new stock certificates reflected that fact and added a set of restricted covenants. But the roaring 20s weren't roaring so much anymore. In many places, the Depression started way before the 1929 stock market crash. In the Grove, there were already vacant properties, assessments that hadn't been paid. And as always, the Grove was operating at a deficit. The Washington Suburban Sanitary Commission had to be paid its annual fees, whether the citizens paid or not. The Gaithersburg, Washington Grove Volunteer Fire Department needed its annual contribution from the Grove. Roads needed to be repaired. Snow needed to be plowed. The Grove was in a financial mess. And after the stock market crash, things only got worse. This is a flyer for a camp meeting in 1928. The charter had dropped the words camp meeting, and indeed there were no camp meetings in the mid-20s. This 1928 flyer was an attempt to resurrect them, but the gathering was a financial failure and an embarrassment. It would not be tried again. In 1925, testing the waters, stock certificates again for transfer to himself. Again, it was denied. The major's daughters, Lucretia Hardy and Janet Walker, attempted a rapprochement with the trustees, but they were rebuffed. Mrs. Hardy then ran for a seat on the board and was elected. Robert presented the shares again and was denied again, but this time not unanimously. At a subsequent meeting, he appeared again, this time with a 17-page legal argument in favor of the transfers and citing wording from the court's earlier decision about his lawsuit. He was prepared to mail the opinion to the entire list of stockholders, but in January of 27, the board relented. They transferred the shares, but they also voted to create a committee to, quote, look into the matter of titles to land in and the government of Washington Grove. After a year of trying, that committee never managed to meet. The board then appointed a smaller committee, which significantly included Robert and Mrs. Hardy. In 1927 and 28, the group managed to get the options down to either a special taxing area like Chevy Chase or a full municipality. They reported at the next annual meeting, but that produced no results other than to expand the number of options to include a possible merger with Gaithersburg, ouch, or even a new charter for a social corporation, the equivalent of a country club. As the Depression deepened, the situation worsened. Many residents would not or could not pay their assessments. In 1931, a committee included both Roy McCatherine and Robert Walker, a good sign, but it was dissolved again with no progress. And then an even smaller committee of McCatherine, Walker, and Mrs. Hinson managed to come up with something called Plan Number 3. Under that plan, the Grove would be incorporated as a town to be called Washington Grove. At the annual meeting, the plan was rejected. Then came the Prescott opinion. The Grove's attorney in Rockville, Stedman Prescott, had earlier rendered the verbal opinion that because of the diversity of titles issued to the residents, the association was legally powerless to collect its assessments. He recommended against trying to sue the recalcitrant owners because if the suit failed, more would stop paying their fair share. In 1935, the board asked Prescott instead for a written annotated opinion. In that opinion, the fatal flaw of the association was graphically exposed, and now in writing. It stated that, quote, "It is not possible to collect delinquent assessments by a civil suit." But the board wasn't satisfied. They found another attorney who was willing at least to test the idea. He wrote and filed a lawsuit against one recalcitrant owner on Brown Street. The trial was scheduled for March of 1936, but there were delays, and in May, the case had not yet been heard. Then the trustees learned that the owner had hired Stedman Prescott to defend him. Prescott was a dangerous adversary under the circumstances, his having studied the association's position so recently and so thoroughly. Everyone took a deep breath. Change was inevitable. Everyone knew it. The annual meeting that year elected a new president, Dr. Elman Cook, a son of one of the Grove's founders. After the tally, and rich in symbolism, Dr. Cook was personally escorted to the chair by Roy McCatherine and Robert Walker. The lawsuit was immediately dropped, and a new committee on revision and reorganization was named. Yet the new committee again wrestled with the options available, one of which was to simply dissolve the corporation and let the county have its way. No one wanted that, but they would still have to choose between becoming a special taxing area or a full-fledged municipality. Finally, they opted for plan number 3 and submitted a charter for possible ratification by the Maryland General Assembly. So the crisis that had been brought on by flaws in the concept of a stockholders association finally came home to roost. On Saturday, March 12th, 1937, the committee's report was delivered and adopted at the Grove. Washington Grove would be incorporated once again, but this time as a municipality. The new town of Washington Grove was to have a form of government that would be unique in the state, and still is. Like most municipalities in Maryland, it would have a mayor and council, but it was also to have an annual town meeting at which the budget and other matters would ultimately be decided by people. At the 1937 annual stockholders meeting, the corporation dissolved itself. At the first meeting of the new town, Roy McCatherine was elected as the first mayor. He would serve in that capacity for 20 years. What happened after the association was disbanded? Becoming a town didn't change the fact that the Grove was in decline, with many empty and even abandoned cottages. In spite of the mandate, some houses were not yet connected to sewer and water. But there was a glimmer of hope. Some of the families from the camp meeting in Chautauqua eras, Walkers, McCatherines, many others, were still around, and they weren't just going to let it go. Others came for the convenience of the commute by rail and stayed for the tranquility. Still others began to use the Grove as their weekend getaway, especially in the summers. How this all worked out is the topic of my second book, but I can tell you that within 2 years, the world was at war. Washington was swelling with new bureaus and new residents, my family being some of them. The trains ran on time, and it was an easy commute from Washington Grove to the centers of power. The auditorium, the assembly hall, and the ball fields, the tennis courts were rejuvenated. The new town climbed out of the Depression and into a new life. Visiting. I encourage you to visit the Grove, not to drive through it. There are enough cars there now, but to park at the railroad and walk the same path that tens of thousands have taken in the past and still do in the present. Up Grove Avenue to the Circle, then out one of the many avenues that will take you back in time to admire the plan, the architecture, and the calm that is Washington Grove. It's been 30 years since I left the Grove. When I visit now, it's with nostalgia, but also with an abiding sense of continuity. Whoops. Now I've lost my slideshow. Oh dear. Well, so I wanted to show you a picture of the circle in about the time that my family moved there, and then another picture taken by the current mayor just a few weeks ago, and they are practically identical. So we started with a quotation from Roy McCatherine. I'm going to end with the closing stanza only of another poem by McCatherine titled Washington Grove and written in 1937 when the association had just become the town. He writes, rustic settings one seldom sees in journeys touching everywhere. 'Tis here we find such perfect ease, with quaintness left to nature's care. Blessed restfulness amid our trees, a porch, a hammock, a rocking chair. Thank you for listening.
All right. Thank you so much, Phil. That was fantastic. We're going to go ahead and jump right into questions here. Again, if you have a question, you can use the Q&A button, and we'll get to as many of those as we can that are related to the talk today. Jackie asks, in the early days of Washington Grove, were all the people who moved there followers of Wesley?
I'd have to say they were followers of Methodism. There were probably 6, 7, maybe even 8 Methodist churches. Some of them were AME, but those Methodism was a very powerful influence in the Washington and Baltimore areas. So I would say most of the stockholders were Methodists or very close to Methodists.
Okay. Someone asks, do you know why it was called the Albany Hotel?
No, I have no idea.
Okay.
Great.
Someone just picked the name. All right. Someone asks, they have an ancestor named Andrew Heil, Heil, who was an early resident of Washington Grove, and they're curious if he was a mayor of Washington Grove.
I don't think, well, if he was an early resident, then that would have, if he held office, it would have been the president of the board. But I do not recall I do recall the name, certainly, but I do not think that Ohio was president and definitely later not a mayor.
Okay. Let's see here. Someone asks, where would they go to look at records of where a relative of theirs might have worked at the post office of Washington Grove in the 1960s? Any suggestions on that?
Wow. There are people in Washington Grove right now who could name everybody who worked at the post office in the 1960s. I could myself if I could just conjure them up. right now. I certainly I knew them all. Margaret Work would have been the 70s, I think. Hmm.
Does the name Elizabeth McDermott mean anything to you?
Yes, it does. It does. Yeah. Sorry, I can't put my finger on it right now. But yes, Elizabeth McDermott is a familiar name.
Nancy, if you want to send me an email directly, I can put you in touch with Phil, and perhaps we can get that answered for you. Um, this is an interesting one. Do any of the houses in Washington Grove have basements?
Yes. Yeah, that's a good question. Of course, they did not any of them have basements in the way olden days. But so we lived in a rental at first, closer to the railroad, and then my parents bought their first house ever at 206 Grove Avenue. And my father, not having a lot of money left over from having bought it, spent the next few years digging out the basement by hand. Across the street and up a little from us, Phil Winter, who was a grandson of Major Walker, dug his basement out. My father used the dirt from his basement to make the mound that is now that you park against when you park for events at the Assembly Hall. And Phil Winter used the dirt under his house to redo the tennis courts. So yeah, a number of houses have basements. Probably all of them wet.
Okay. Any connection between Washington Grove and Asbury Village and Gaithersburg beyond Methodist origins of both?
No, I don't think so. The name Asbury appears very often in the mid-Atlantic states, and it's because of his good work uh, selling Methodism.
Okay. What can you tell us about Washington Grove's status as a historically dry town?
Oh, wow. I was very much involved with that. Yeah, so in the camp meeting days, dryness was considered quite a virtue. And of course, there were always hooligans and profiteers trying to sell liquor to the thousands of people who were gathered there, and of course sometimes they were successful. So during its entire history, the association was dry. The town was dry, but it didn't have to assert dryness because the county was dry. And then, gosh, was I mayor? I'm not sure, but we decided to assert our dryness forever by getting the Maryland legislature to sign off on a law recognizing Washington Grove as dry. That came about because there was a commercial corner. There is a commercial corner in Washington Grove, and someone wanted to open a restaurant and serve liquor, and that was very much opposed by the residents, and so that's what spearheaded that action. So the town is now officially dry.
Okay. Someone asks, I've heard that attendees to Emery Grove camp meetings were barred from walking through Washington Grove. Can you say more about the relationship between the two towns camp meetings?
Yeah, there is a lot to say about the relationship between the two towns. Obviously, a lot of it was labor oriented. In the early days, Emery Grove people, attended the camp meetings, but also worked on the construction and maintenance of the houses. An Emery Grove resident actually became the superintendent of the town during the winters at one time. This issue of people from Emery Grove being barred from walking through the town has arisen again recently It's a bit of a flap. I think my recollection of what happened is sometime, I think it's the 20s, early 20s, could be teens. There were some break-ins of cottages during the winter. Obviously, not a lot of people around to guard. And a black man was accused, arrested, and went to jail for that. We don't know. I don't know if he was guilty or not, but at some point subsequent to that, the association closed its gates so that people arriving on the train to get to Emery Grove would have to go around. Now it's probably 2 miles to Emery Grove from the train station. So it was definitely an inconvenience not to be able to go straight up Grove Avenue. But how big is Washington Grove? Probably a quarter of the journey. And so it's probably likely that some form of transportation would have been needed anyway. So I don't defend that action, but I think that was probably what caused it.
Okay. In that same vein, when did Washington Grove start allowing people of color, and how did that integration affect the area?
Wow. Yeah, that's a big loaded question too. So in my time, Montgomery County was a segregated county. Maryland was a segregated state. Washington Grove and Emery Grove existed apart, but with a lot of interaction. There was no formal rule that would prevent a black person or anybody from, or an Asian, or God, a Jew from owning property. But there was a tacit understanding, as with many, many communities throughout the state. So until that first covenant was put on, when the charter was revised and the stock share was revised, there was nothing written that would bar anybody from owning property in the Grove. After that, those covenants are so trickily and evilly worded that they wouldn't ever stand up in a court of law, and have not when tested. But even as late as 1952 or 3, when my parents bought their house, it had a covenant on it that prevented, and I think the quotation runs something like, people of a race whose death rate is higher than that of the Caucasian race would not be allowed to own the property. Of course, that was a ridiculous rule, and I hope all those covenants are gone, but they're not enforceable.
Okay. Someone asks when the large auditorium was torn down.
Oh my gosh, I was just married. I was on my way out of town one morning and was shocked to see the building was gone, and there was a pile of smoking ashes. It was such a sad thing. The auditorium had been in decline for a long time. When I was a kid, it was still very actively used. Programs for children, there were entertainments, films. But in the early 50s, it fell into just repair. It was vandalized. And then I was actually part of a plan to turn it into a summer theater. And I helped present a plan to the town council. But the idea of having a commercial venture there in town and cars streaming in on Fridays and Saturday nights was just too much for the townspeople, and they rejected the proposal at a town meeting by a single vote. In fact, it was a single vote that was changed from its first vote to its second vote, and that really doomed the auditorium. So it wasn't the rejection of the theater that doomed it. It was just that it was very difficult to maintain and had no real use at the time. It was about 1963 and a half, roughly.
Okay. Okay. Is the Hershey's restaurant any relation to the town cottages or later built?
It's built, I don't know when it was built. It was certainly there very, very early. It was a store. It almost has to have been built when the railroad went through. So it was the store. It was the store that I used to stop in to warm up on the way walking to Washington Grove Elementary School. It was the store where the sixth grade class, all three of us were sent down to view Mr. Spillman's body when he was laid out in what then later became the post office. And it was it was purchased by, after Spillman died, it was purchased by Charlie Hershey, a longtime Washington Grove associate and resident. And then his wife, Doris, who had a particular recipe for chicken, opened a chicken selling stand inside the store. And then pretty soon it became the restaurant.
Okay. So you briefly mentioned the post office. Was there anything, someone asks, was the post office important? Can you talk a little bit about that, the post office in Washington Grove?
Yeah, well, the post office was for years inside the town, but in camp meeting times, so of course the railroad delivered the mail, and in camp meeting times, the post office thrived in or near the hotel. I don't remember which, but the post office department wanted to set up a permanent post office, and they had their own bureaucratic ways, and the Grove not being occupied during the winter, they thought that was a pretty foolish way to have a post office. So they ended up putting it in Spillman's store. It was it was on the right-hand side at first, in a covered porch, and very lean. Later, it moved to the parlor, what had been the parlor of the house, where Spillman's body had been laid out, and it was set up there, a much more efficient operation. Run, as I recall, by Mrs. McNamara. Anyway, that's what I know about the post office. And then, of course, now it's back in Washington Grove, at the commercial corner.
Okay. Someone asks, maybe I missed it, but where did the name Washington Grove come from?
Oh, I think it's just the churches of Washington, the Methodist churches of Washington, wanted a campground, and they decided to call it Washington Grove. Makes sense.
There's nothing special there. Okay. All right. Any relationship between Washington Grove and Durwood?
Ooh. It's interesting. Yeah, I don't have a special sense of a relationship between Washington Grove and Durwood. Yeah, I'm sorry, I don't.
Okay, no problem. Let's see here. Do you know the population approximately of Washington Grove today?
Oh my gosh.
Putting you on the
No,
spot here.
no, everybody there does. It's
All right.
probably the same as it was when I was there.
Okay. If someone wanted to visit the area, what would be the boundaries or the streets they would go to be inside Washington Grove?
Well, yeah. So Railroad Street is the road inside Washington Grove that runs next to the railroad, not surprisingly. There are two ways from the south into Railroad Street. One's on a grade crossing off Oakmont Avenue. The other one is off Central Avenue, which comes over the Humpback Bridge. That's probably the one you'd want to take because you get to experience going over a bridge where your eyes are so up in the air that you can't see what's coming in front of you. Fortunately, there's a traffic light there. So if people are obeying the traffic light, you won't get run into head on the top of the bridge. Yeah, so if you cross the bridge and turn right on Railroad Street, then parking, actually there's parking on both sides of the tracks, but there's parking there, a little bit of parking for the railroad station. And from there, if you were going to walk up Grove Avenue is just backtracking a little to the west. And I encourage you to do it.
Okay. And just to circle back a little bit, we've had a couple people chime in and say the population is between 500 and 600. And I'm seeing a couple numbers in that range. So I'm not going to cherry pick numbers. We're going to say between 500 and 600. Okay. I think we're going to actually go ahead and wrap it up there. We're at about 3:15. So Phil, any closing thoughts before we finish up today?
Ooh, closing thoughts. Uh, hmm. Well, I'll tell you what. The town has copies of my books, and if you buy one from them, I don't make anything on it, but you help the town. And there's a lot of information in there uh, in both copies. So I'd encourage that.
Okay. And you can get that from the town, and then you said also from Amazon, correct?
That's right. Yeah.
Okay. All right. Well, Phil, thank you so much. This is fantastic. I do apologize we didn't get to every question, but thank you for your great talk, and we'll talk again soon. Thank you so much.
Appreciate it very much, man.
Have a good afternoon, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye.